was about 4 years ago, on New Year's Eve, when this happened. I was hosting a small party at my house to celebrate. At the time, I lived close to the city in a really busy neighborhood. My house was a two-bedroom, two-story place, and I'd only been living there for a few months. Most of the people I invited were friends from work. We all worked at a large company and were part of the same department. Initially, I planned to invite about 5 people, but word got around at the office, and more folks asked if they could come. I was fine with it. I thought, the more, the merrier. Everyone promised to bring something, food, drinks, snacks, so I figured it'd be fun. My house had more than enough space, so I spent time setting everything up to make it cozy and comfortable for everyone. People started arriving around 6 p.m. My best friend, Ben, was the first to show up. He helped me with a few last-minute things before others began to arrive. Soon, my coworkers started trickling in, and before I knew it, there were about 15 people at my house. We had snacks laid out on the table, music playing in the background, and we started playing a few games. The atmosphere was lively, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. It felt like the perfect way to celebrate the new year. At some point during the evening, I noticed a guy I didn't recognize. He was standing near the edge of the room, kind of keeping to himself. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed he came with someone, and since everyone seemed to be chatting and laughing, I let it slide. A little later, I noticed him talking to Rachel, one of my coworkers. They seemed to be having a pretty involved conversation, so I figured they must know each other. Still, something about him felt off. He wasn't as engaged as everyone else. He had this distant, almost detached look on his face. After a while, I saw the guy again. This time, he wasn't talking to anyone. He was standing alone in a corner, just watching people. It gave me an uneasy feeling. I decided to ask a few people if they knew who he was, but no one seemed to have a clue. That's when I started to get nervous. This was my house, and I had no idea who this guy was or how he got in. I thought maybe Rachel would know. I found her sitting in the dining room, talking to another coworker. I tapped her on the shoulder and asked about the guy she'd been talking to earlier. She frowned and said she didn't know him either. She added that he'd been acting a little weird around her and had told her he was an old friend of mine. That caught me off guard. I was sure I'd never seen this guy before in my life. Now I knew I had to do something. I didn't want to cause a scene, but I couldn't just let this stranger hang around. I decided to go back to the living room and talk to him. But when I got there, he wasn't in the corner anymore. My heart sank a little. I looked around the room but didn't see him anywhere. I started to feel a mix of relief and worry. Maybe he'd left. But why would he just leave without saying anything to anyone? I asked my friend Jake if he'd seen the guy leave. Jake shook his head and told me the guy had gone upstairs. That feeling of relief I had a second ago disappeared instantly. There was no reason for anyone to go upstairs, because the whole party was happening downstairs. My stomach twisted into a knot. What was this guy doing up there? I found Ben and told him about the situation. He agreed to go upstairs with me to check things out. We walked up the staircase together, our footsteps feeling loud in the quiet. The upstairs hallway was dimly lit, with just a bit of light spilling in from the bottom of the stairs. There were 3 doors, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. As we reached the top of the stairs, we both noticed the door to the spare bedroom slowly closing. My heart was racing now. I walked up to the door and knocked firmly. "Hey, who's in there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer. Ben and I exchanged a look. I knocked again, harder this time. "You need to come out right now," I said. But the room stayed silent. We waited for what felt like forever, but it was probably just a couple of minutes. Still, there was no response. I didn't want to just barge in. What if he had a weapon or something? I whispered to Ben that maybe we should go back downstairs and call the police. He nodded, and we quietly backed away from the door. When we got back downstairs, the party was still going strong, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the stairs, half expecting the guy to come down. By now, it was almost midnight, and people were starting to get ready for the countdown. I decided I'd give it a little more time. If he didn't leave on his own, I'd call the cops. Midnight came and went. People started trickling out, saying their goodbyes and wishing us a happy new year. By the time the last guest left, it was just me, Ben, and the mystery guy. I was on edge, knowing he was still somewhere in the house. Ben and I decided to go back upstairs and check again. We crept up the stairs, moving as quietly as we could. The hallway was just as dark and silent as before. This time, the spare bedroom door was open. My stomach dropped. We checked the room, but it was empty. Then we checked the bathroom. Nothing. That left my bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my hands shaking. The room was empty. Ben and I were standing there, trying to figure out what to do next, when we heard the faint sound of footsteps behind us. We both spun around just in time to catch a glimpse of the guy heading down the stairs. He moved quickly, not even looking back at us. We bolted after him, but by the time we got to the bottom of the stairs, the front door was already swinging shut. Ben and I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, our hearts pounding. He was gone. Just like that. We locked the door and checked all the windows to make sure everything was secure. Then we searched the entire house again, just to be sure he wasn't hiding somewhere else. We didn't find anything missing. Not a single thing was out of place. That was almost the strangest part of it all. If he wasn't here to steal anything, then what did he want? Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Who was he? How did he get into my house? And what were his intentions? The fact that he didn't take anything makes me wonder if he was there to hurt someone. I'll probably never know the answers, but it's something that'll always stay with me. That uneasy feeling of knowing someone was in your home, uninvited, and you have no idea why. That feeling doesn't ever really go away. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. If you stuck around until the end, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. As always, I'm looking for more story ideas, so drop a comment below with any themes or experiences you'd like to hear next. Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep your eyes open. It was New Year's Eve of 2020, a year that no one would ever forget. The world had barely started adjusting to the pandemic and the strange new reality that came with it. Everyone was trying to figure out how to live in this new world, trying to adapt to the restrictions, the isolation, and the uncertainty that hung in the air. For some, the sense of normalcy was slowly returning. But for my family and me, it was still a time of strange uncertainty. My two children, Sean and Jason, were both 8 years old. Jason was about to turn 9 just a week before New Year's, which made this holiday even more special. A week before New Year's, my brother reached out and invited us to stay at his beach house in Maine. We hadn't seen him in years, and he and his wife Cheryl were eager to host us for the holidays. It sounded perfect. The idea of spending a few days together, away from the stresses of life, was exactly what we needed. My brother always went all out for both New Year's and the 4th of July, putting on spectacular fireworks shows that everyone in the area looked forward to. This year he had promised a show unlike anything we had ever seen before. He had been working on a new firework launcher, a homemade automatic launcher that could shoot several fireworks at once, and we were excited to see it in action. It was like something out of a professional show, something that you would expect at a big festival or an official event. His beach house was located on a private beach, which meant that we wouldn't be disturbed by anyone else. There were only a few other houses on the beach, most of them vacant. It felt like we had the whole place to ourselves, a perfect setup for a quiet, private holiday getaway. The kids were thrilled to be at the beach, and we all enjoyed the freedom to relax and have fun without worrying about crowds or other people. It was an idyllic place, the kind of place where you could escape and forget about the world for a while. On the first day, which happened to be New Year's Eve, we spent the day preparing for the big fireworks show. We fired up the grill for a big family barbecue. The kids played on the beach, running around, building sandcastles, and just enjoying their time. They were in their element, living in the moment and full of energy. My brother and Cheryl were fantastic hosts, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. We spent most of the day just chatting and relaxing, catching up with family. It had been so long since we'd all spent time together, and it felt good to reconnect, even if it was under strange circumstances. As the sun began to set, the air turned cooler, and we knew it was time for the fireworks show to begin. My brother had spent hours preparing everything, making sure that everything was set up just right. He had a big area on the beach where he set up his firework launcher, and we all gathered around in chairs to watch the show. The sky was darkening, and you could feel the anticipation building. The kids were on the edge of their seats, their faces lit up with excitement as they looked up at the sky, ready for the first burst of color. We had our drinks in hand, and I could hear the sounds of laughter and chatter all around me as we waited for the fireworks to start. When the first firework went off, it was like the world came alive. The explosion of light and sound filled the sky, and everyone cheered. One after another, the fireworks exploded, lighting up the sky with every color imaginable. It was beautiful, breathtaking even. We all watched in awe, the night sky illuminated by the fireworks. My brother had really outdone himself this time. The kids were excited, their eyes wide with wonder as they pointed at each new firework that lit up the sky. It was the kind of show that made you feel like you were part of something special, a moment you'd never forget. But as the fireworks continued, something caught my eye. It wasn't one of the fireworks in the sky. It was something in the water. I had been watching the fireworks with my family, but then Sean, my youngest, tugged at my arm. He pointed toward the water, and his face looked a little concerned. At first, I didn't know what he was talking about. I looked toward the water, trying to make sense of what he was pointing at. The ocean was dark, and the night was quiet, except for the occasional boom of the fireworks. It was hard to see anything clearly, but then a firework went off in the distance, illuminating the water just enough for me to see something. At first, I thought it might have been a buoy or something else that was just floating out there in the water. It wasn't unusual to see something like that, and I figured it was just another piece of debris. But as I focused on it, I realized that this wasn't any regular buoy. The shape was wrong. It was too large, too irregular. It seemed to be made of several pieces of wood and bamboo, crudely tied together. The moment I saw it clearly, my stomach dropped. Something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't just an abandoned piece of junk. It looked intentional, like it had been built for a purpose. I turned to my wife, who had also noticed the strange object in the water. She suggested that it might be some sort of container or floating device, but the more I looked at it, the more I felt like something was off. It wasn't just a random object. The way it was floating out there in the water, alone and isolated, felt strange. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an unease that I couldn't shake. It was like we were witnessing something we weren't supposed to see, something that didn't belong. We decided to pause the fireworks show for a moment and take a closer look. My brother and I walked down to the water's edge, trying to get a better view of the strange object. It was far enough out that we couldn't swim to it, and we weren't about to try. The water was cold, and the waves were crashing against the shore. We didn't know what to expect, but we both felt compelled to figure out what it was. My brother went inside to grab his binoculars, hoping that they would help us get a clearer view from a distance. Through the binoculars, we could see it more clearly. It was indeed a raft. A makeshift raft built from pieces of wood, bamboo, and other materials that looked like they had been scavenged. It was still floating out there in the water, bobbing up and down with the waves. But there was no one on it. There was no sign of anyone around. It was just this strange, floating structure, abandoned in the middle of the ocean. My brother and I exchanged looks. Neither of us could make sense of it. There were only 3 other houses on this beach, and 2 of them were abandoned. The third house was my brother's, where we were staying. So where had this raft come from? Who had built it? The more we thought about it, the more questions piled up. My wife suggested that we call the Coast Guard, but I wasn't sure that was the right thing to do. After all, the raft didn't seem like it was an emergency. There were no people in distress, no signs of anyone who needed help. It was just this strange object, bobbing in the water like some kind of forgotten relic. But something about it didn't sit right with me. It felt wrong. The more I stared at it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that we were witnessing something that had been left behind, something that shouldn't have been there. The idea that this raft had come from the sea, that someone had used it to escape or to reach the shore, sent a chill down my spine. What if the people who had built it had never made it? What if something terrible had happened out there, and this raft was all that was left of them? We stood there, staring at the raft for what felt like an eternity, each of us lost in our own thoughts. My brother kept talking about calling the Coast Guard, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to cause a scene over something that seemed so insignificant, but deep down, I knew there was something off about it. I kept thinking about the people who had used it, who they were, why they had been out there, and what had happened to them. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. It was like we had stumbled onto something we weren't meant to see, something that would never be fully explained. Eventually, we decided to leave the raft alone. The fireworks resumed, but I couldn't enjoy them the way I had before. That raft was still in my mind, lingering like a shadow. We finished the night, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we had seen. I lay awake in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought of that raft and the people who had once used it. What had happened to them? Were they still out there, lost at sea? Or had something far worse happened, something that would never be known? The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the raft had been a warning, a sign of something darker. We didn't talk about it much after that night, but every now and then, the thought would creep into my mind. What if we had seen something we weren't supposed to see? What if that raft was the last remnant of a tragedy that no one would ever know about? We never found out the truth, but one thing was for certain. We'd never forget that night on the beach, the night when we saw something we couldn't explain, something that would haunt us long after we left, that quiet stretch of coastline. It was a cold New Year's night, the kind that was perfect for staying in, wrapped up in blankets with a drink in hand. But my girlfriend and I had spent the evening at a friend's party. We didn't mind it too much, though, as we had a good time catching up with people we hadn't seen in a while. By the time we left, it was already past 1:30 in the morning. We lived in the city, and the drive back from our friend's place, which was out in the suburbs, usually took around 20 minutes. It was the kind of drive where you could see the glow of streetlights fading away as you left the busier parts of town. The roads were quieter than usual, but still, there were more cars on the highway than you would expect for such an early hour. People were still out celebrating the new year. The usual hum of the tires on the road and the faint sound of the radio played in the background as we drove, but something about the night felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As soon as we merged onto the highway, I noticed a car following us. Not just behind us, but way too close for comfort. I made a point to stay in the far right lane, hoping they'd pass us. It wasn't the first time I had dealt with a tailgater, and usually they'd zoom around, get their spot, and leave you alone. But this car didn't pass. Instead, it just stayed there, creeping closer and closer, almost like they were trying to touch the back of our bumper. I glanced over at my girlfriend, who had also noticed. "Did you cut them off or something?" she asked, clearly confused and a little concerned. "No, I didn't," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I flicked the turn signal on, planning to switch over to the middle lane. Still, the car didn't pass us. It just kept staying right behind, a few feet away, as if daring me to make a move. The highway stretched out in front of us, the road clear except for this one car following us. It felt strange, like I was being watched. I didn't want to worry my girlfriend, but it was starting to get uncomfortable. I checked the side mirror and could see the car's headlights reflecting in the darkened windows, its presence more pronounced with each mile. We drove like that for a few more minutes before I noticed the car still behind us, following our every move. I had planned to take an exit soon, but now, with the car stuck right behind us, it made everything feel 10 times worse. I sped up a little, hoping to get ahead and out of the car's way. As I did, the other car sped up too. They matched our speed exactly, keeping us in the same position as we approached the exit ramp. Now, with them alongside us, I could see that it was a cherry red Mustang, its headlights cutting through the night. I couldn't make out anything about the driver, though, since the windows were so darkly tinted. For a split second, I thought I saw some movement inside, but I couldn't be sure. I wasn't about to stare too long either. My eyes flicked back to the road ahead. I slammed on the brakes, trying to put some distance between us. The car in front of us swerved a little, but I didn't waste time. I quickly merged into the lane, pulling in front of them. That's when I saw it. A car with no license plate. No temporary tag either. My heart skipped a beat. Why would someone be driving a car like that, especially at this time of night? Now both of us were on edge. We could only guess who was behind the wheel. Maybe it was a drunk driver, or maybe it was something worse, something more dangerous. My girlfriend didn't like the idea of being followed like this, and I couldn't blame her. I didn't feel much safer, but I tried to stay calm for both of our sakes. We exited the highway, and so did the Mustang, still staying just ahead of us, weaving in and out of traffic, as if it had no care in the world. We pulled up to a red light, and I didn't want to look over, but I had to. The car slowed down, but it didn't turn. It stayed in the lane, right in front of us, as if waiting for us to do something. I didn't put my turn signal on, not yet. I didn't want to give them any idea of where we were going, though part of me wondered if it even mattered. They were already so close. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, and my fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. The car didn't use its turn signal either, which only made things more unsettling. It was almost like they were playing a game, watching us, seeing how long they could follow. I finally decided to make a move. I flicked on the blinker and turned into the right lane, hoping that would give me a chance to break free. But no, the Mustang followed, right into the lane with us. Now, it was obvious. This wasn't just a random encounter. They were intentionally trying to stay with us. My girlfriend's voice was tinged with worry now. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this felt normal. Still, I kept telling her that it was probably just some punks messing around. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We turned down another street, and for a moment, I thought I had shaken them. But then, in the distance, I saw the red Mustang, its headlights shining, still following us. It didn't stop, not for a second. It was relentless. They'd managed to keep up no matter how many turns I made, how many side streets I took. No matter what I did, they were still there. I started to panic. I needed to get rid of them. There was no telling what they were going to do next. As I pulled into a neighborhood, I quickly glanced in the rearview mirror. The Mustang was right behind us, gaining speed, coming closer. It had to be going over 100 miles per hour by now. My heart raced even faster as the car shrank the distance between us, almost like it was daring me to try and escape. I had to act. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I explained what was happening. As I spoke with the dispatcher, I turned off the headlights to try and make it harder for the Mustang to see where we were going. I cut down another side street, hoping that it would work, that somehow I could get away. But the Mustang didn't let up. It followed right behind, as if there was no way they were going to stop until they got what they wanted. The dispatcher calmly told us to drive to the nearest police station. They'd have officers waiting in the parking lot to meet us. The station wasn't too far away, but it felt like miles. My mind raced with every turn, every stoplight. The road ahead was still clear, but the fear gnawed at me. What if we didn't make it? As we neared an intersection, the light turned red. The cars in front of us came to a halt. We didn't have much time. My foot slammed on the brake, and we stopped just in time. But that was when things got even worse. I watched in horror as the red Mustang pulled up behind us, the high beams blinding me. It felt like the world had stopped. I glanced in the side mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. At least 3 masked people got out of the car. They moved quickly, approaching us in the dark. My girlfriend was frozen in fear, but I had no time to think. I laid on the horn, hoping anyone, would notice and help. Then it happened. One of the masked figures rushed up to the passenger side and with one swift motion, smashed the window. My girlfriend screamed. The sound still haunts me. She was pulled toward the door, but we were lucky. The car in front of us, realizing what was happening, sped through the red light, clearing the way for us to drive forward. We gunned the engine, narrowly avoiding a crash, and sped through the intersection, still on the phone with the dispatcher. The Mustang didn't follow us anymore, and as we raced toward the police station, I couldn't believe what had just happened. My hands were still shaking as we pulled into the station, the adrenaline wearing off but the fear still lingering. We gave the police what little information we had, but without a license plate or a clear description of the people involved, there wasn't much they could do. We never heard anything about the Mustang or the masked figures again. To this day, I don't know what their intentions were or why they followed us. It was a freaky incident, one that neither my girlfriend nor I will ever forget. But we're just thankful that we made it out.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
A few years ago, on New Year's Eve, I was about 20 years old. I had always been the type of person who preferred quiet nights at home, spending time with my family. I never really liked the whole party scene. I always thought about how short life was, and how important it was to cherish the moments we had with the people we loved. My parents weren't going to be around forever, and I made sure to make the most of the time I had with them. I didn't mind staying in and keeping to myself, but this year, one of my friends was not going to let me get away with it. His name was Matt. I had known him since high school, and we'd been pretty good friends back then. However, after I moved away for college, we lost touch for a while. We had kept in contact off and on, but it wasn't the same. Matt was the type of person who loved to throw huge parties, and that's exactly what he was planning for New Year's Eve. His parents were going to be out of town that week in New York, and he had decided that this would be the perfect opportunity to throw the biggest party of the year. He kept asking me to come, and for weeks I told him no. I wasn't interested. I wasn't a party person, and I didn't really feel the need to go out and get drunk with a bunch of strangers. But after a lot of back and forth and a little bit of pressure, I finally agreed. I figured it would be good to catch up with Matt, and after all, it had been a couple of years since we had seen each other. It wasn't like I had any other plans, so I decided to give it a shot. I'd been stuck in my own little bubble for too long, and maybe it was time to get out and do something different. I arrived at his house a little after 8 p.m. The place was huge. His parents had a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, and it looked like he had invited just about everyone he knew. When I stepped inside, it was like walking into a completely different world. The music was loud, the lights were bright, and people were everywhere. There was a crowd of people in the living room, and others were dancing and mingling outside. The whole house was alive with energy, and for a moment, I stood there, feeling a little out of place. I didn't know anyone here except Matt, and that made me a little nervous. But as the night went on, I started to loosen up a bit. I grabbed a beer and wandered around the house, trying to get used to the atmosphere. The party was big, but it was still fun to see Matt again after all this time. He introduced me to a few people, and we talked about everything from school to our plans for the future. It was nice to catch up, and for a moment I was starting to enjoy myself. The crowd didn't seem so overwhelming anymore, and I even started dancing with a few of the girls Matt had introduced me to. By 9 p.m., the house was packed. There were easily around 100 people there. The DJ was playing upbeat music and people were dancing, drinking, and celebrating. Matt was busy running around, making sure everything was going smoothly. He had a whole crew of friends helping him, and it was clear that he was really into hosting. I wasn't much of a dancer, but I found myself tapping my foot to the beat and talking to a few more people as the night went on. As the evening continued, I started to feel more comfortable. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and the party was in full swing. There was laughter everywhere, and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. Matt kept trying to get me to talk to more girls, but I wasn't really into the idea. I wasn't shy, but I wasn't a big flirt either. I was just there to have a good time and catch up with Matt. At one point, I went inside the house to grab another beer. I was standing by the snack table, scanning the room for Matt, when I noticed a man standing alone by the bar. He was older, probably in his mid-40s, tall with glasses, and dressed in a plain shirt and jeans. There was something about him that didn't quite fit in with the rest of the partygoers. He didn't look like he was there to have a good time. His presence felt out of place. I glanced at him for a second, and then, to my surprise, he looked right back at me. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and something about it felt strange. I couldn't explain why, but the way he looked at me made me feel uneasy. Then, without warning, the man started to walk over to me. He had this calm, almost too composed expression on his face as he approached me. He didn't seem like he was in a hurry, but there was a certain purpose in his step. When he reached me, he introduced himself. "Hey, I'm Nate," he said, offering his hand. Nice to meet you," I replied, a little unsure of what to say. His handshake was firm, but it didn't feel warm. It felt forced, like he was trying too hard to be friendly. We exchanged pleasantries, and for a moment, it seemed like a normal conversation. He asked if I was enjoying the party, and I told him that I was. But then, out of nowhere, he started asking me more personal questions. "So, what do you do?" he asked, his tone casual, but it felt too probing for someone I had just met. I told him a little about myself, but the conversation started to feel weird. He didn't seem interested in what I had to say. Instead, he asked more questions, ones that didn't seem to have much to do with the party or the people around us. It was as though he was trying to get under my skin. I wasn't sure what he was after, but the conversation was starting to feel uncomfortable. There was a long pause, and I felt the weight of the silence. It was like the conversation had hit a dead end. I looked around the room, trying to find an excuse to walk away. "Well, it was nice meeting you, Nate," I said, forcing a smile. I turned to walk away, but then, as I looked back at him, I saw it. He was staring at me. Not a casual glance, but a long, unblinking stare. His face was expressionless, almost too still. The way he was looking at me made my skin crawl. I didn't know what it was, but something about his stare felt unsettling. I quickly turned away, trying to shake off the feeling that had crept up on me. The rest of the night went on like any other party. People were still dancing, laughing, and celebrating the new year. I didn't see Nate again, and I tried to push the weird encounter out of my mind. I had a good time with the people I knew, but that moment with Nate kept bugging me. It was like something didn't sit right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Eventually, it was time for the countdown to the new year. The whole party gathered outside in the backyard, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. Fireworks lit up the sky, and everyone cheered as the new year began. We all raised our glasses and wished each other a happy new year. The moment was filled with excitement, but then something happened that would change the tone of the night entirely. As we watched the fireworks, a loud scream suddenly pierced the air. It was a woman's scream, one that sounded absolutely terrified. Everyone froze for a moment, and then we all turned to the house. The scream had come from inside. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. What the hell had happened? Matt and a couple of other guys immediately ran into the house, heading toward the stairs where the scream had come from. I followed behind, my mind racing. What was going on? Was someone hurt? My legs felt like lead as I moved through the crowd and up the stairs, trying to make sense of what was happening. When we reached the top of the stairs, we found a girl standing in the hallway, shaking with fear. She was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" Matt asked, his voice frantic. She could barely speak at first, but then she managed to get the words out. "I was in the bathroom," she said, her voice shaking, "and I saw an eye. There was an eye looking at me from the closet." She started to cry, her body trembling. The realization hit us all like a ton of bricks. Someone had been hiding in the bathroom closet, a stranger. Matt immediately called the police, and we waited for them to arrive. The whole house was on edge, everyone nervous and unsure of what was going on. The girl who had seen the eye was still in shock, but we did our best to comfort her and make her feel safe. The police arrived shortly after, and they immediately began searching the house. When they questioned the man, Nate, he didn't resist. He admitted to everything. He had just walked into the house like he was part of the crowd, and no one had noticed him. He had hidden in the bathroom closet, waiting for an opportunity to do who knows what. The police later found out that Nate was wanted for multiple assaults, including one on his ex-wife. The details of his past were chilling, and it made the whole situation even more terrifying. He had been at the party the entire time, just walking around like he belonged, and we had no idea who he was or what he was capable of. The rest of the night was a blur. We all tried to get back to the party, but the mood had completely shifted. The fun and excitement of the new year had been replaced by an overwhelming sense of fear. No one felt safe. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl in the bathroom and what could have happened if she hadn't screamed. In the days that followed, we learned that Nate had been arrested and charged with several crimes. Thankfully, nothing worse had happened, but the thought of what could have been haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of that cold, emotionless stare he had given me earlier in the night. Years have passed since that New Year's Eve, but I still think about that night. I have a girlfriend now, and I'm much more cautious about the people I let into my life. That night taught me to always be aware of my surroundings, to never let my guard down, and to trust my instincts. The world can be unpredictable, and you never know what might be lurking in the shadows. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. A few years ago, I moved into a small, one-story house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just on the edge of the suburbs, giving me what felt like the best of both worlds. The houses weren't packed too close together, so there was plenty of privacy, but it was still close enough to town to make grocery runs and errands easy. The area didn't have streetlights, so at night it was pitch black unless the moon was out. I didn't mind the darkness. In fact, I liked it. It gave the house a quiet, peaceful feeling, like my own little bubble away from the world. I'm a nurse, so I'm used to working odd hours and holidays. That year was no different. I worked Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and as it turned out, I was also scheduled for New Year's Eve. I didn't mind too much, though. I didn't have much family to celebrate with, so staying busy at work was better than being alone. On New Year's Eve, I ended up staying overtime to help out. By the time I got home, it was about 7 in the evening, and I was completely drained. The night was dark and cloudy. Without any streetlights, the only light came from my car's headlights and the dim glow of my porch light. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd, a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. It struck me as strange since I didn't smoke, and I'd never smelled it around my house before. I sat in my car for a moment, scanning the quiet street. Everything seemed normal. The neighboring houses were dark, and there wasn't a soul in sight. Shrugging it off, I told myself it was probably someone walking by earlier and went inside. All I wanted to do was take a quick shower and collapse into bed. My shift had completely worn me out. After cleaning up, I didn't even bother turning on the TV or checking my phone. I just climbed into bed and fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime later, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, but it was definitely coming from inside the house. At first, I wasn't alarmed. My friend sometimes stopped by after work to use my shower on his way to his night classes. I'd even given him a spare key. The thing is, he always texted me first to let me know, and I didn't remember hearing my phone go off. Groggy and still half asleep, I reached for my phone on the bedside table. The bright screen lit up the dark room, momentarily blinding me. Squinting, I saw it was 9:30, and sure enough, there was a text from my friend. Relieved, I set my phone down and called out his name. Silence. I called out again, a little louder this time. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, hurried footsteps coming from downstairs. My heart dropped. Those weren't the familiar, casual steps of my friend. They were frantic, purposeful, and loud enough to send a jolt of fear through me. Without thinking, I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. I pulled the door open and slipped inside, just as I heard the intruder start up the stairs. My hands were shaking as I looked up and remembered the attic access panel in the ceiling of the closet. It was my only chance. As quietly as I could, I pushed the panel up and began hoisting myself into the attic. My muscles strained as I pulled myself up, trying not to make any noise. Just as I got my feet off the closet floor, I heard them reach the top of the stairs. The house had 3 rooms upstairs: my bedroom, the guest room across the hall, and a small bathroom at the end of the hallway. My bedroom door was closed, but the bathroom door was slightly open. I stayed as still as I could, listening intently. The footsteps paused outside my door before it was shoved open with a loud bang. I froze, pressing myself against the attic floor as tightly as I could. The intruder moved around my bedroom, their heavy steps echoing in the quiet house. I heard drawers being pulled open and things being tossed onto the floor. After a few minutes, the footsteps left my room and headed toward the guest room. The door slammed open, and I could hear them rifling through the boxes and odds and ends I had stored in there. I knew they wouldn't find much. That room was mostly empty except for some old weights, a table, and a few paintings I'd been working on. Moments later, the footsteps came storming back into my room. This time, the light flicked on, illuminating the space below me. My heart was pounding so loudly I was afraid they'd hear it. Then, I heard the closet door creak open. From my vantage point in the attic, I could see their legs through the opening. They were wearing dirty jeans with frayed cuffs and scuffed work boots. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look up. For what felt like an eternity, the intruder stood there, scanning the closet. Then, without warning, they let out a guttural scream of frustration. It was a raw, angry sound that sent chills down my spine. The scream reminded me of my stepfather's outbursts when he'd lose his temper, wild and uncontrollable. The intruder stomped out of the closet and back down the hallway, their heavy footsteps echoing through the house. I stayed crouched in the attic, listening as they tore through the downstairs rooms. I could hear furniture being flipped, glass breaking, and drawers being yanked open. The chaos seemed to go on forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. The stillness was almost worse than the noise. I strained my ears, trying to catch any hint of movement, but there was nothing. I didn't dare move. I started counting in my head, trying to keep myself calm and gauge how much time had passed. I made it to 1,000 before I finally worked up the courage to climb down. My legs were trembling as I lowered myself into the closet, and I nearly stumbled when I stepped onto the floor. The first thing I noticed was that my bed had been flipped over. That must have been the loud crash I heard earlier. My room was a mess. Clothes were strewn everywhere, and the drawers from my nightstand had been pulled out and emptied onto the floor. My phone was nowhere to be found. I crept over to the landline by my bed and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The operator stayed on the line with me until the police arrived. When I heard the officers calling out from downstairs, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I hurried down to meet them, but the sight of my living room stopped me in my tracks. The place was a disaster. The couch was flipped, chairs were overturned, and the contents of my shelves were scattered across the floor. In the kitchen, the cupboards were open, and canned goods and boxes of food were spilled everywhere. Despite all the damage, the only thing missing was a single knife from the wooden block on the counter. The police searched the house from top to bottom and found how the intruder had gotten in. The side door had been pried open, likely with a crowbar. Outside, near the fence line, they found cigarette butts, a piece of foil, and an empty pen tube, items often used for drugs. It was clear the person had been watching my house for some time, waiting for the right moment to break in. The thought made my skin crawl, that smell of cigarette smoke I noticed when I got home. It hadn't been from earlier in the day. They'd been there, just outside, watching me as I pulled into the driveway. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. The police advised me to stay somewhere else for the night. But I didn't have any nearby friends or family. Instead, I spent the night cleaning up and barricading the broken door with a heavy bookshelf. Every so often, I'd shine a flashlight out the windows, scanning the fence line where the cigarette butts had been found. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The next day, I had the door repaired and installed motion-activated lights around the house. I also ran a phone line up to the attic, vowing never to be stuck up there without a way to call for help again. Though I lived in that house for another 3 years, nothing like that ever happened again. Still, the memory stayed with me. Every night when I climbed into bed, I couldn't help but think about how close I'd come to being found that night. The image of those dirty jeans and scuffed boots standing in the closet doorway is something I'll never forget. This story happened on New Year's Eve of 2016. I was living in Iowa at the time, and anyone from around here knows how bitterly cold the winters can get at night. The snow outside had turned everything quiet and still. When it snows like that, the world seems almost frozen in time, and every little noise stands out. That night, my best friend Colton and I were hanging out in my family's walkout basement. We didn't have much planned, just a boring New Year's Eve spent playing video games. My mom had gone out to a bar right after work to have a few drinks with her coworkers, so we were completely alone in the house. At some point during the night, Colton and I decided it might be fun to sneak into the family's wine cabinet and grab a bottle to celebrate the new year. We didn't think much of it. It just seemed like a harmless way to pass the time. As we sat there opening up the first bottle, laughing quietly about how we'd need to put everything back exactly as it was so my mom wouldn't notice, I suddenly heard the sound of the garage door opening and then slamming shut. I froze. For a second, I thought maybe my mom had come home early, and my first instinct was to hide the bottle. My heart was racing as I looked around for a good spot to stash it. That's when I heard heavy footsteps, deliberate and loud, moving from the garage toward the stairs. Then I heard my mom's voice call my name. "Hey, can you come help me with something?" she said, her voice echoing down the stairs. At first, I felt a wave of relief. It had to be her, right? But something about the situation still felt off. I yelled back, "I'll be there in a minute," and listened for her reply, but there was nothing. Just silence. A minute passed and I heard her call out again. This time her voice sounded different. It was her voice. I was sure of that. But it didn't feel right. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite explain. It was almost like her tone was missing some kind of warmth, like it was flat or hollow. Then she asked me a question that made my stomach drop. "Is anyone down there with you?" That question hit me hard because it didn't make sense. My family never cared if I had friends over. Our house was always open to anyone, and my mom had never once been bothered by Colton being around. The way she asked it, though, felt wrong, like she was suspicious or something else entirely. I turned to Colton, who was already looking uneasy, and whispered, "Something's not right." Still, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe she was just tired from work or something. So, I yelled back up, "It's just me and Colton." As soon as I said that, though, I regretted it. The second the words left my mouth, a heavy silence fell over the house. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. After a few moments of stillness, I decided I needed to go upstairs and see what was going on. I told Colton to stay put and started climbing the stairs. As I reached the top, I realized the house was completely dark. Not a single light was on. That wasn't like my mom at all. She always turned on the kitchen light or the living room lamp when she got home. I called out, "Mom," but there was no reply. The only light came from the dim glow of the snow outside. barely illuminating the kitchen windows. I stepped into the kitchen, my footsteps sounding way too loud in the silence. I called her name again, louder this time, but still, nothing. My uneasiness was growing. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. To my surprise, she picked up immediately. "Hey, where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm still at the bar," she said. "What's wrong?" Her answer made my blood run cold. If she was still at the bar, then who the hell was in the house? I quickly explained what had happened, and her voice turned serious. "Listen to me," she said. "Go back downstairs. Lock the basement door. Stay there? I'll be home in 5 minutes." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted back down the stairs, grabbing my coat along the way. When I got to the basement, I locked the door and told Colton everything. He looked as scared as I felt, but we didn't have much time to think. A few minutes later, we started hearing noises upstairs. It wasn't footsteps exactly, but we could hear movement. The kind of movement that lets you know someone's there, even if you can't see or hear them clearly. It felt like the house wasn't empty anymore. Colton and I sat there in silence, barely daring to breathe. Every now and then, we'd hear a faint creak or a rustle, like something shifting around above us. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to let us know we weren't alone. My mom had said she'd be home in 5 minutes, but those minutes felt like hours. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Finally, after what felt like forever, we heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. Almost instantly, the feeling in the house changed. Whatever had been upstairs, whatever had been making those noises, it was gone, just like that. The second her car arrived, the oppressive, heavy presence vanished. When my mom came inside, I ran up to meet her, talking so fast I could barely get the words out. She took one look at me and Colton, and knew we weren't making it up. We all went upstairs together, and even though everything seemed normal at first, we could all feel that something wasn't right. The house felt off, like it was holding its breath. We checked every room, every corner, but we didn't find anything. No open windows, no unlocked doors, nothing out of place. It was as if whatever had been there had vanished without a trace. My mom tried to reassure us, but I could tell she was shaken too. She told us it was probably nothing, maybe just our imaginations running wild, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe it any more than we did. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. It had sounded so much like my mom, but at the same time, it hadn't. It was like something was trying to mimic her but didn't quite know how to do it perfectly. And then there was the feeling in the house, that overwhelming sense of being watched, of not being alone. It still gives me chills just thinking about it. I never found out what happened that night. My mom passed away a few years later, and I've since moved to Arizona, but every New Year's Eve, I think about that night. I think about the voice that called my name and asked me to come upstairs. Whatever it wasn't human. I don't know how I know that, but I do. And every time I remember that night, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had gone upstairs a little sooner, or if my mom hadn't answered the phone. Some questions, I guess, are better left unanswered. Hey everyone, I'm curious to know more about you all. Drop a comment below and let me know which country you're watching from. I love seeing how far our community reaches, so don't be shy. I'll be reading through the comments. On New Year's Eve of 2016, my family and I gathered at my Aunt Sarah and Uncle John's house to celebrate the end of the year and the arrival of the new one. This event had become a tradition, something we all looked forward to every year. It was the highlight of our holiday season. My aunt and uncle were wonderful people. They always made me feel welcome, loved, and cared for. They were always there for me, whether I needed advice or help with something. Uncle John, especially, had a special place in my heart. He was like a second father to me. Whenever my parents needed help or guidance, my aunt and uncle were the first ones they turned to, and they always stepped in without hesitation. Uncle John wasn't just a great person. He was also an outdoorsman through and through. He was the type of man who loved camping, fishing, and everything related to nature. If there was a chance to go out into the wilderness, Uncle John would take it. He would often bring me along on his adventures, teaching me about the woods and how to survive in the wild. I admired him for it. He made nature feel like a place of wonder rather than fear, something I'll always be grateful for. The small piece of land behind their house was mostly covered by trees and brush, and Uncle John used this area for his fishing and camping trips. It was a quiet, secluded area that I never thought much about. It was until that night. It was around 7 p.m. when we finally arrived at their house. My mom had made her famous casserole, which was always a hit at family gatherings. There were about 60 people in total at the party. Family, friends, and a few people I didn't recognize. I was only 12 at the time, so I wasn't too interested in the conversations or the music. Most of the adults gathered around the living room to drink, laugh, and talk about the year that had passed while waiting for the ball drop at midnight. It was the kind of event where everyone was either chatting or playing board games, enjoying the evening with those they loved. As usual, I was the only kid at the party. I wasn't bothered by it, though. I had always been more of an introvert, preferring to keep to myself rather than getting involved in the chaos of adult conversations. I was content to sit in the rocking chair on the back porch and watch the fireworks display in the distance. The night was crisp, and the air had that cold bite that only comes with winter. It wasn't unbearable, but it made me pull my jacket tighter around me as I settled into the chair. The first firework lit up the sky, its bright light illuminating the area around me. The burst of color made everything feel momentarily alive, and for a second, I felt the excitement that everyone else seemed to have. But as the fireworks continued, something else caught my attention. Something that I couldn't ignore. As another firework lit up the sky, I saw him. A man. Standing just beyond the tree line of my aunt and uncle's wooded area, partially hidden by the thick trees. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. He was tall, and even in the dim light, I could make out his form standing still and watching me. At first I thought I might have imagined him, but then, in the next burst of light from a firework, I saw his face. Pale and still, as if he had been standing there for a while, waiting for something. I couldn't look away. Something about the way he was staring at me made my skin crawl. His eyes were dark, and he wasn't moving at all. For a moment, I thought about calling out to someone, but I didn't. I felt frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, the man slowly raised his hand, and with a subtle motion, he beckoned me over to him. It wasn't an aggressive motion, but there was something about the way he waved that made my stomach churn. I wasn't sure if I should go over, or if I should ignore him and call for help. But at that moment, I didn't move. I stayed where I was, too afraid to approach, yet too curious to leave. The man didn't say anything at first, but there was something about the way he looked at me that seemed off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but everything in my body told me to be cautious. Then, after a few moments of silence, he spoke. "Hey there," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "I'm a friend of your uncle's. I've got a late Christmas present for you." For a brief second, I thought that maybe he was telling the truth. After all, Uncle John knew a lot of people, and if he was a friend of his, maybe he was just being friendly. But even then, something didn't sit right with me. Why was he hiding behind the trees? Why didn't he just come out into the light to say hello? I wasn't sure what to do. A strange mix of curiosity and fear swirled inside me. I looked down at my feet, unsure of whether I should walk away or approach him. The man continued to stand there, motioning for me to come closer. He seemed harmless enough, but the feeling in my gut told me that this wasn't right. Still, I couldn't shake the curiosity. What did he want? What kind of gift was he talking about? Before I could make a decision, I heard a familiar voice cut through the night. It was my dad, shouting from behind me. "Hey, who are you?" The moment my dad's voice rang out, the man stiffened, as if he hadn't expected to be noticed. His body tensed for a second before he turned and sprinted toward the woods. He disappeared into the dark trees so quickly that I barely had time to react. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what had just happened, but I felt a surge of relief that my dad had been nearby. He quickly ran toward me, his face showing signs of both anger and concern. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, grabbing my arm gently and pulling me toward the house. "Who was that man? What did he want?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice trembling. "He said he was a friend of Uncle John's, and that he had a present for me. But I didn't go closer. He just wanted me to come over to him." My dad didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Without wasting any time, he marched me into the house, where my mom, aunt, and uncle were still talking and enjoying the party. He explained everything that had just happened, and immediately, my aunt and uncle became serious. "That man is not a friend of ours," Uncle John said, his voice sharp. "We don't know him. We don't know what he was doing out there. He shouldn't have been anywhere near our property." Aunt Sarah immediately grabbed the phone and called the police. They needed to know everything I could remember about the man's appearance, his height, his maroon hoodie, and the fact that he had been hiding behind the trees. The officers arrived quickly, and we all waited in a tense silence as they began their search. The police combed the woods with flashlights, calling out into the dark, looking for any sign of the man. They walked through the trees, their footsteps crunching in the snow. My heart raced as I watched them, my thoughts swirling with questions. Who was this man? Why had he been watching me? Was he planning something worse than just scaring me? After a while, the police returned. They hadn't found anything. No sign of the man. He had vanished, leaving only the lingering sense of unease behind. The officers said they would keep an eye out in the area, but they couldn't find any trace of him. The thought that someone had been watching us from the woods and was now gone, leaving no evidence, sent chills down my spine. That night, the party continued, but it wasn't the same. Everyone was on edge. People kept glancing over their shoulders, and no one seemed to relax. The fun of ringing in the new year had been overshadowed by the strange man in the woods. What was his plan? What would have happened if I had gone closer? What was he after? There were so many unanswered questions. As the night wore on and the countdown to midnight began, I found myself thinking about what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad had almost happened. If my dad hadn't shown up when he did, if I had walked a little closer to the man, things could have turned out very differently. The fear of what might have been stayed with me long after the fireworks had ended and the ball had dropped. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I wonder who the man was and why he had been there. What had he wanted from me? What would have happened if I hadn't listened to that gut feeling that told me not to go over? I don't know if I'll ever get those answers, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget that night, and I'll never look at the woods behind my aunt and uncle's house the same way again. Last year marked my 4-year anniversary with my boyfriend. We hadn't really done anything big to celebrate in the past, so this time we wanted to plan something special. At the time, we were living in Massachusetts, and after tossing around a few ideas, we decided a romantic weekend getaway was exactly what we needed. Vermont seemed like the perfect choice. It's well known for its wintry charm, and we hoped to find a cabin tucked away in the woods, blanketed in snow. After searching through Airbnb, we found what seemed like the ideal spot. It was a cozy cabin with a hot tub, surrounded by trees, and owned by a man named Jerry. He was new to Airbnb, but his listing already had 3 5-star reviews. That seemed good enough for us, so we booked it without hesitation. My boyfriend's heavy-duty truck was perfect for snowy roads, so we decided to drive. As we got closer to the cabin, about 10 minutes out, I noticed my phone lost service completely. We tried my boyfriend's phone, and thankfully it still had a signal, so we used it to finish the route. When we were about 5 minutes away, the GPS led us onto a remote private road. The road was narrow and lined with tall, snow-covered trees, making it feel isolated. It ended in a small roundabout, and from there, the driveway to the cabin began. The driveway was long, steep, and covered in fresh snow. At the top of the hill, the cabin came into view, and I couldn't help but admire how beautiful it looked. Thick white smoke was curling out of the chimney, and the snow covering the roof made it look like something out of a postcard. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage, and we had to climb a set of icy stairs at the back to get to the front door. I was already imagining the warm fire and the peaceful weekend we had ahead of us. When we got inside, there was a booklet left on the kitchen counter with information about the cabin. It included a note explaining that a plow service was contracted to clear the driveway whenever it snowed, so we shouldn't be alarmed if we saw tire tracks or heard someone plowing. Because that made sense, and it helped ease any concerns about being in such a remote area. We unpacked our bags and settled in. The cabin was cozy, and while we quickly realized that my boyfriend's phone also had no service, the booklet mentioned a landline in the kitchen in case we needed it. That first night was everything we hoped for. We lit a fire, played board games, and watched Christmas movies while the snow fell outside. It was quiet, peaceful, and exactly the getaway we needed. We planned to spend the next day exploring the nearby town and then have dinner at a restaurant where I'd made a reservation. The following day went smoothly. We spent most of the day in town, walking through small shops and enjoying the local charm. We returned briefly to the cabin in the afternoon to get ready for dinner before heading back out. The restaurant was amazing, and by the time we finished eating, we were excited to get back to the cabin, relax in the hot tub, and enjoy the rest of the night. As we drove back, we noticed the temperature had dropped, and a fresh layer of snow had blanketed everything. It was picturesque. As we turned onto the private road leading to the cabin, my boyfriend suddenly slowed the truck and stopped. The headlights were shining up the driveway, and he turned to me and asked, "Do you see those tire tracks?" I hadn't noticed them at first, but as I looked closer, I realized there were fresh tracks leading up the driveway. It was strange because the driveway hadn't been plowed, and we hadn't seen anyone all day. Maybe the plow service came by, I suggested, though it didn't make much sense since the snow clearly hadn't been touched. Still, we tried to convince ourselves it was nothing. My boyfriend turned the truck around and drove us back into town. He sent a message to Jerry through Airbnb, asking if he or someone else had stopped by the cabin. We waited for a while in a parking lot, but no reply came. We could have called Jerry on the landline, but it was already late, past 10 p.m., and my boyfriend assured me I was probably overthinking it. After a while, we headed back to the cabin. When we arrived, we drove all the way up the driveway and parked in the garage. As I stepped out of the truck, my stomach dropped. There, in the fresh snow, were footprints. They started from the middle of the driveway and led towards the cabin. I froze and called my boyfriend over. He followed the tracks with his eyes, and we both felt the creeping unease. Someone had clearly driven up the driveway, parked, gotten out of their car, and walked onto the property. But where had they gone? The cabin was surrounded by thick trees, and with all the snow, it was impossible to tell where the footprints ended. We both agreed it was better to be safe than sorry. We drove back down the road until we had cell service and called the local police. An officer arrived shortly after, and we led him back to the cabin. He walked the property, shining his flashlight into the trees and checking every corner of the cabin. After a thorough search, he told us he didn't find anything. The officer reassured us it was probably nothing and left. We were embarrassed but still on edge. The idea of relaxing in the hot tub now seemed out of the question. Instead, we locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat in the living room watching TV until we finally felt calm enough to laugh at our paranoia. Exhaustion eventually took over, and we fell asleep on the couch. Around 3 a.m., we both woke up at the same time. The TV was still on, and all the lights were on, too. I didn't know what had woken us up, but we figured it was probably just a log popping in the fireplace, or some other harmless noise. We decided to head to the bedroom to get some proper sleep. My boyfriend went to brush his teeth while I tidied up the living room. That's when I heard it. A low, mechanical humming sound. It only lasted a few seconds, but it was unmistakable. My boyfriend came running out of the bathroom, his face pale. "Was that the garage?" I whispered. He nodded, his expression grim. There was no reason anyone should be opening the garage at that hour, especially when the cabin was clearly occupied. We had left all the lights on, so anyone outside could easily tell we were inside. We sat frozen in silence, straining to hear any other sounds. Then we heard it. The door from the garage to the cabin unlocked with a loud click. My boyfriend grabbed his pistol from his suitcase and quickly loaded it. We could hear slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the cabin. Despite my fear, I followed closely behind my boyfriend as he crept down the hallway towards the living room. When we rounded the corner, we saw him. A man with his back turned to us was standing in the middle of the room, holding something in his hand. My boyfriend raised the pistol and ordered the man to turn around. The man jumped in surprise and slowly turned to face us, raising his hands in the air. My stomach dropped when I saw his face. It was Jerry, the cabin owner. His face was bright red, and he stammered, "I didn't know you were here already." In his hand was a cheap camera. My boyfriend demanded to know what he was doing there, and Jerry stumbled over his words, claiming he'd mixed up the dates and thought the cabin was empty. But his explanation didn't make sense. Why would he come into the cabin in the middle of the night? And why did he have a camera? I ran to the landline and called the police while my boyfriend kept the gun trained on Jerry. The officers arrived quickly and took him into custody. We explained everything, but in the end, Jerry wasn't arrested. He somehow convinced the police that it was all a misunderstanding, claiming he'd marked the wrong date on his calendar. Disgusted and shaken, we packed our bags and left that night, checking into a hotel. We reported the incident to Airbnb, who banned Jerry from their platform and gave us a full refund. But the whole experience left us uneasy. What had Jerry really planned to do? And why did he have that camera? We'll probably never know, but one thing is certain. We'll never stay at another remote cabin again. For the rest of the night, we barely spoke. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified in the silence, and the glow of the morning sunlight was a relief when it finally arrived. Vermont's snowy beauty had lost its charm, leaving us with memories we'd rather forget. It was a trip meant for celebration, but instead,